Islip near Oxford has got a claim to fame. It's said that the great Saxon king Edward the Confessor was born somewhere round here, and the local villagers want to celebrate the millennium anniversary of his birth. So they've asked us whether we can find the 13th century chapel that was built in his honour. Not only that, but they want us to find the Saxon palace where he was born, which seems to me a pretty tall order. Except the fact is, nobody has ever dug here before, and we've got just 3 days to try and sort it all out. Oh, and by the way, that isn't the chapel we're supposed to be looking for. The village of Islip is about 6 miles northeast of Oxford, and these days it's home to some 600 people who'd love to find some actual evidence in the ground to prove their link with Edward the Confessor. I don't know about you, but I always get really confused by all the English Saxon kings and their elaborate names, so I'm very pleased to see this bloke. Sam.
Morning, Tony.
What are the dates of Edward the Confessor?
1042 to January the 5th, 1066.
And what's he famous for?
He's famous for keeping the country safe for a generation and for the great building project at Westminster Abbey, but on the downside, big succession crisis because no children.
So then you get King Harold, Arrow through the eye, and William the Conqueror.
That's right, and Battle of Hastings.
Why is he called the Confessor?
It's a name given to him long after his death, once he became regarded as a saint. A confessor is like a priest, a monk.
This is very quick history, this, isn't it? Do we actually know that he was born here?
Well, as far as we can tell from the charter in Westminster Abbey, which we're going to have a look at tomorrow, the fact is he was born here according to his own words.
Most important and difficult question, where's Mick?
Last seen near the pub, I believe.
You amaze me. Is that down there?
Yep, straight through there.
Cheers. Mick? Mick's talking to the 2 villagers who invited us here, and he's showing them Victor's drawing of the kind of building Edward might have been born in 1,000 years ago.
We've drawn here a timber hall, the sort of thing you'd get on a Saxon palace of about 1000 AD. And you see it's built of timber posts, wattle-work between, it's got a timber roof, it's thatched or shingles. It's all perishable materials. It's going to be very difficult to find that in the ground, in the small plots that we've got available to us.
But how many Saxon finds have there been in the village so far?
None at all.
So even if we find 1 Saxon pottery sherd, it'll double the amount of knowledge we've got so far. We should be able to find something, shouldn't we?
Yeah, well, we should be able to find some Saxon pottery, but I'm much more optimistic about finding the chapel that you wrote to us about. We've got a drawing by Thomas Hearne in the 18th century, look. And you see, at this time, it's been turned into a barn, but you can see it was the chapel. Because this is stone built, unlike this one, which is timber, our chances of seeing that in the ground, I think, are that much better.
So, to begin with, we're going to have a go at finding this medieval stone chapel, built in honour of Edward the Confessor. And this illustration by antiquarian Thomas Hearne is the only clue we have to what it actually looked like. Helpfully, Hearne tells us that it was situated to the north of the church, which probably means that it's now buried under one of these gardens. But the villagers reckon it's going to be easy to work out where it was.
Stuart, on the face of it, this looks extremely simple because I've just spotted site of King's Chapel and a big cross. So what's the problem?
It does look pretty obvious, doesn't it? Now, the problem with these crosses, when the map makers were coming round in the late 18th century, they were soldiers. Mm-hmm. They'd speak to the local vicar or local antiquarian, and he might have said, there was a palace over there, or there was a moat over there, or there was a chapel over there.
And it wasn't that important to them.
No, it wasn't. So that could be one of 2 things. It could be somebody precisely knew where that was, and that is bang on. Mm-hmm. Or alternatively, it could be just, it was over in that yard somewhere, and the surveyor just put the cross there.
Tricky.
Stuart's worked out where the cross would be on the modern map.
And it falls firmly in the middle of that timber yard.
So are the buried walls of the chapel under here? Well, Geophys did a radar survey in the timber yard earlier this morning, and they're now ready to look at their results.
The X marked on the map is literally here.
Right in the middle?
Yep.
That's interesting because we've got no clear target, but there is one in the far corner. And the second target genuinely is in the middle. There.
That doesn't look very clear.
It isn't very clear. It's not an easy area for us to survey. All the problems with things around the outside.
Well, there's only one way we're going to find out if the chapel was here, and that's by digging a hole. The trouble is, this is a working timber yard, and it looks like there might be 1 or 2 delays.
How long do you think?
Depends where it is on the lorry, really. Should be half an hour, 3/4 of an hour.
We'll wait.
Yeah.
And if you want it done quicker, you can always give us a hand.
There you go, John.
Well, this is a surprise. No resistance from Geophys. Let's hope it's all worth it, because of course we can't trust the big X on the map. It's quite possible that the remains of the chapel could be in the pub car park. Or in the garden of the house next door. There's no room for Geophys to survey in this garden, so we've decided to open up a few random test pits. Possibly foolishly, the owners have given us permission to dig anywhere we want to, because their property has a name that could be a clue to the location of the chapel. Yeah, this is the one, look. There's the clue, Confessor's Gate. Jonathan, Confessor's Gate, is it a good clue?
Confessor's Gate, well now, your deeds, Joanna, they call the house...
It was called St Edward's originally. It's now called Confessor's Gate.
Okay.
I'm not sure when it was renamed.
And it looks like this gate has actually taken on that name because we have a figure of a head right over the top.
Ooh.
The problem is, this arch and the wall it's in is no older than about 100 years old. So we have to look at that really closely.
Jonathan's wondering if the figurehead itself could be medieval.
It's weathered nicely. It's got a lot of weathering on it. It's also stuck around the back with cement, like it's a found item that's just been applied. But
The trouble is, he doesn't think it's Edward the Confessor. He thinks it's a woman.
I think it's more like Edwina the Contessa rather than Edward the Confessor. The reason being that it's headgear, because that to me looks like a wimple, standard late 14th, early 15th
If that was a
century.
mitre, it'd be like this, wouldn't it? Down over the sort of forehead.
It would.
Whereas actually it's pushed right back up like that, isn't it?
Exactly that.
Is your heart bleeding? It's either Victorian or it ain't Edward.
Well, it's not quite what I thought.
I reckon that's going to fit easy, innit?
Well, at least now we know this gateway's not ancient. We can risk trying to squeeze a mini digger through to speed things up. But there's still a very good reason for digging here in the garden of Confessor's Gate, and that is the house deeds include a plan that marks the site of the King's Chapel.
That little square there is where the map maker shows us the chapel. It's tiny and it's the wrong direction.
But on the other hand, if that's the east end of it, it would be over there somewhere where the blue sheet is. It would be coming back this way.
I'd be incredibly happy, wouldn't it, if that were right?
That'd be better, wouldn't it?
And it extends underneath our feet with something up to that sort of size.
Yeah.
So we're going to extend one of our test pits in this garden to cover that possibility, even if one of the residents has other ideas.
Damn thing! You got it!
So with a trench in this garden and one in the timber yard, which has just got going again, we've got 2 possible sites for our chapel.
We can actually see that the chapel actually fits many times over inside Confessor's Gate.
It's bigger than the house again, isn't it, actually?
It's quite surprising.
Thomas Hearn not only made a sketch of the chapel, but also recorded its basic dimensions. And this has allowed Ray Sand to build a 3D model.
That's lovely. I wonder whether there's a direct relationship of the space within the woodyard and the size of the chapel, whether that's a direct result of demolishing it and using its space. If that was a barn, after all, it might have a crew yard in front of it, mightn't it?
Meanwhile, Victor has gone to church. He's making a sketch of Edward based on his image shown in this copy of the Bayeux tapestry. History doesn't get any bigger than this, and I'm still hopeful we might stumble on the Saxon palace where Edward was born. Edward's failure to produce an heir may have resulted in the Battle of Hastings in 1066, but he was also responsible for the building of Westminster Abbey. As I understand it, Edward left the manor of Islip to the monastery before he died. Westminster then built the chapel in Islip in honour of Edward some years later. Jonathan's trying to work out exactly when that was.
There are a group of 3 windows and quite fine masonry in there, actually. These are 3 lancets, typical of the early 13th century. So are these clasping buttresses before they become diagonal in the later 13th century. To me, those features suggest a date 3 decades either side of 1220.
The chapel was built more than 150 years after Edward's death, which would put it in the reign of Henry III. This would make sense, as Henry was obsessed with the memory of Edward the Confessor, who'd been made a saint in 1161. Henry rebuilt Edward's Abbey at Westminster and may have been responsible for building the chapel in Islip. He was keen to popularise the figure of Saint Edward and encouraged the cult following for him that was growing in the 13th century.
The cult of St Edward is one that had been growing through the reigns of previous kings. Really flowers in Henry III's time. And what it seems to represent is a way of those Norman and Plantagenet kings giving legitimacy to their rule over the English. At the same time as, for the English themselves, Edward being the last of the legitimate Old English kings, it thus represents a kind of reconciliation focus for the French and the English.
So it's as though the Normans are saying, it's all right, Saxons, because we're related to Edward the Confessor, who you like.
Exactly, exactly.
But why would they want to come here? I can understand them wanting to go to Westminster Abbey, where Edward the Confessor was, but why would any pilgrims want to come to this place?
Well, it's widening the base of the cult and the opportunities for pilgrimage centres by celebrating his birthplace.
But I mean, what would a pilgrim expect to see something?
Yeah, architecturally, when you walk through the door, what are you going to see?
What's in there? Well, that's the tempting thing. I mean, there must be some cult object, some of his personal clothing or personal items, perhaps his old nursery toys.
We just secondary items, really, yes. not the body, but
anything
clothing.
He's touched. I mean, during his life, even the water in which he washed his hands was deemed to be crackling with spiritual radioactivity. It was that potent and could then be used for miracles.
I think a load of 13th century dinky toys would be brilliant, though, or the equivalent,
Well, it would be nice to find anything, because so far there's no sign of the chapel in any of our trenches. This is a really lovely garden, and of course we're doing our best to wreck it. We've got a trench in here, and that's an 18th or 19th century cobbled farmyard surface. We've got another trench just around here, and hang on 1 minute, just turn around here. And you can see our family having a cup of tea. But anyway, we've got our farmyard cobbled surface still in this trench. And here, cobbled surface again. As usual, Phil's working incredibly hard for the cause. But is he wasting his time? Stuart's got some news for us.
Whatever you're going to say to us, Stuart, you better say it soon, as you're going to get buried, I think, because the way Phil's going at it there.
Am I right in understanding that you put this trench in on the basis of a deed?
Yeah, a little map in the deeds,
yeah. It's supposed to show where the site of the King's Chapel is.
That one, yeah.
This deed, showing site of King's Chapel and the little building there, is actually a straight copy of the 1922 map. Over here, we see a little building.
And in fact, the antiquity sign is in the wrong place.
That's right.
It's in the plot next door.
Over in the lumber yard over there.
Truth.
Hold on. So where it says here, site of King's Chapel, and we've dug in this one.
Yeah, but it's
actually referring to this cross.
It's referring to that cross.
And that's the cross that's in the lumber
they
yard.
didn't put the cross on there. Look.
Phil, you're digging in the wrong garden. Nick misinterpreted the map.
Hey, hang on. Several people misinterpreted the map.
No, hang on.
He's going to start chucking stuff.
Why am I in the wrong garden?
Because the big X that says site of the chapel is actually next door.
Over there.
All right.
It's only the writing that's across this garden.
Well, I'm still not going to leave this one until we resolve what's here.
Quite right.
Thank you.
Quite right. But don't hold your breath, I think is the answer.
Phil's absolutely right. We have to finish these trenches. The map on the deeds may be wrong, but we don't know for sure that the chapel isn't in this garden. Not only that, but there could be Saxon material to find here that's much deeper down.
There are local historians who pointed to...
I'd love to find some Saxon pottery for the villagers at least. And I've heard that this car park might be the place to look, because there are written accounts that say this was the site of the Saxon palace. Is this the kind of place where they might have built a palace?
Well, yes, because it's well sited at the top of a hill, and without the buildings here, you'd have a very commanding view of the surrounding valleys. And you could see people approaching. It's an important crossing point. We've got a very good Anglo-Saxon place name here.
Well, Islip?
Yes, it comes from the Old English "yikslepa," meaning the slipway or the slope by the river, the old river name.
There's no doubting Islip was a Saxon settlement, and this could be the place to dig in search of the palace tomorrow. But now, as we approach the end of the day, there's bad news about our trench here in the woodyard. It's turned up nothing but natural geology. There's no sign of the chapel.
Come on, you want to see this?
But there is still hope, because Stuart's been studying the maps and has a new theory that we might find evidence of the chapel in this garden.
We know it was a detached building from the sketch. It was oriented east-west.
It says that on the sketch
Yeah,
as well.
and it was about 15 yards by 7, so we know that much.
Yeah.
And we know from the references it was likely to be standing in...
1805, a barn standing on the side of the chapel is definitely there in 1805.
Now, this map here is 1806, so it should be on this map, really.
Yeah,
and actually, when you look at the map closely, there are two detached buildings, oriented east-west.
Right.
So
it's one of
it could be
those.
one of those two.
Yeah.
Now,
Right.
one is very close to the church, but it's too small when you measure it. There's another one which is the right size, and that's in this garden here. So logic-wise, we should, if we can, examine both those, but this one looks the better candidate on its size.
Well, the way things are going, I reckon we should dig both sites. The trouble is, this building is buried under the extension to the graveyard. But we might still be able to get permission to dig there with help from local contacts. Joanna, did you manage to speak to your old man?
Yes, I think what we need is an archdeacon's licence rather than we don't have to wait for a faculty because that would take too long. But the office doesn't open until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, so as soon as the office opens, we'll get onto the archdeacon's office.
Thanks very much. That's very good
Fingers
news.
crossed.
So, is the chapel in Joanna's house? Is it next door? Is it under the churchyard? We'll find out tomorrow. Beginning of day 2 here at Islip in Oxfordshire, and one of our main jobs is to look for the 13th century chapel of Edward the Confessor. Now, we know it's this way to the north of the church, and we've already looked in this back garden here, so far with no success. Our next two targets are this back garden and here, which is this extension of the cemetery. Look at it. We don't even know whether we're going to be able to get permission to dig it, but even if we do, how are we supposed to geophys? Frankly, it's turning into a bit of a nightmare. But although we have to wait for special permission to excavate in the graveyard, there's nothing to stop us starting work here, as the owner of this garden has agreed to sacrifice their small lawn in search of the chapel. What's clear is that the whole village wants to find this building, which was built in honour of King Edward the Confessor. Because if we can find it, it will give them some actual physical evidence in the ground to back up their claim to fame, that 1,000 years ago, this village was the birthplace of the last great Saxon King of England. Of course, the villagers would also love us to find Ethelred's palace, where Edward was supposedly born. This would have been a wooden building that would have looked something like this, but likely to have perished over the last 1,000 years. Today, though, we're opening up a trench in the pub car park, because there are some documentary references to both the chapel and the palace being on this site.
There are two parts to this reference, which is in 1823. It says, on the site of a small inn, known by the sign of the Red Lion,
Well,
there we go,
Yeah.
anciently stood the palace of King Ethelred. So, suggests there's a palace somewhere in this area. It also says, in the same yard also stood an ancient building, long used as a barn, but said to have been the identical chapel appertaining to the Saxon palace.
With mention of Ethelred's palace and the chapel in this area, it's got to be worth putting a trench in. Who knows, at the very least, we might find some Saxon pottery for the villagers. Meanwhile, we're still digging in the garden of Confessor's Gate, which so far has only turned up what looks like medieval pottery for our expert to look at. Hello, stranger.
Hello.
Yeah. Good to see you.
And you.
We have a problem. We haven't yet found the chapel, maybe we won't. We haven't found the palace, maybe we won't. But the one thing that people really want is Saxon pottery.
What, like this?
What? Is that really Saxon?
Yeah.
How the heck do you know that that is Saxon?
It's East Wiltshire ware from somewhere in the region of Newbury. I'd say Saxon, Saxon-Norman, 1050 to 1100,
It's actually
something like
right
that.
on the date that we're interested in.
This is Edward the Confessor?
Yeah.
Well, it starts about the end of his, it overlaps with the end of his reign, yeah.
Well, you've taken the wind out of my sails. That's good, isn't it? I'll still ask you anyway. Do you reckon you could trawl round the village and see whether you can come up with Saxon? Because until you got this magnificent find, there'd be no Saxon found in this village at all.
Well, there's this piece as well.
Oh, come on!
Yeah, but this is probably a lot earlier.
This may be considerably early. I think this is actually early or middle Saxon. It was well before Edward the Confessor.
Fantastic. Not only have we found the first Saxon pottery ever discovered here, but we've got one bit that dates to the lifetime of Edward the Confessor. When this pottery was made around 1050, Edward was building Westminster Abbey. And that's precisely where Helen and Sam have gone now, to see the original documents that link Edward with Islip.
Yes, I suppose Westminster Abbey is by far the best place to come to find out about medieval Islip, isn't it?
Well, it is really, because the Abbey owned the manor and most of the documents have ended up in the archives at Westminster. For example, this is a 14th century manuscript which contains a lot of the early charters to do with Islip, including these ones of Edward the Confessor.
Oh yes, I can see the lovely E there for Edward King. My old English peters out about there.
Edward King, great Wolsey Bishop, and
Yerth Earl. Edward the King greets Wolsey the Bishop and Earl Yerth Godwinson.
Freyon Leachy, in a friendly manner.
And Itchkith, I wish it to be known that I have given to St. Peter and Christ at Westminster
That Cotleaf, they ich was geboren in
the little dwelling in which I was born,
be naman yit sleper,
by the name of Islip. Just as Alfievu Emma, my mother, the great Norman lady, on my birthday to former Yiva, as firstborn, gave to me.
So that
it's a birthday present.
Yes, it's absolutely as clear as it could possibly be.
Yes.
Yes. And what date was this written down?
This manuscript dates from about 1310, but it consists of a lot of copies of manuscripts of much earlier date.
So if they're copying it, could they be slipping in a few things that weren't quite true?
That's quite possible, but it does seem unlikely that they would make up a fact like Edward the Confessor being born at Islip. There's no point in making that up, really, especially because people in the early 12th century might have known that if he'd been born somewhere else, they might have known that.
As if we could ever have doubted it, Edward was born in Islip. And believe it or not, just now in the garden of Confessor's Gate, we've made a remarkable discovery celebrating that very fact.
Now, a bit of glass.
Isn't this just what every archaeologist in the world would like to see if they're digging a historical character? Fessa.
Fantastic.
What do you think that is?
Let's see. It looks like it's early Victorian or something of that period, early 19th century. And I suppose it's not Professor, can't be. No, it must be Edward the Confessor.
Oh, it has to be, doesn't it? It wouldn't make sense
it's
otherwise.
after the chapel is used as a barn, so I'm not sure it's from there. And I don't know what, I mean, do you think there's a portrait of him above or something, or maybe there's a rhyme, maybe...
Well, I don't like to disappoint you, but we've also found in, so, or id, possibly. So, doesn't quite tie in as well, but...
Maybe in a garden of Edward Confessor, he kept us a bit of a guesser.
No.
We'd hoped to find more,
down,
but oh, what a bore. Instead we found Edward the Lesser. Maybe that's it.
Thank you for your contribution. Oh, that's nice.
Isn't that beautiful?
Sadly, these pieces of glass aren't from the Confessor's Chapel. They've been found mixed up with a lot of other Victorian rubbish dating to around 1840. And they must have come from a decorative window somewhere nearby. Meanwhile, the news from the trench next door is, I'm afraid, exactly what we didn't want to hear. There's no sign of the Confessor's Chapel. Rakshas found nothing except the undisturbed natural soil, although the trench is being extended to make sure we haven't just missed anything. To make matters worse, in the pub car park, Phil can't find anything either. He reckons any archaeology that was here has been quarried away.
Everything could have been dug away if they were after stone for subsequent building.
Yeah, so it's all been...
I mean, the whole valley, the only thing is that you can be sure of is that there's no Saxon archaeology, there's no medieval archaeology here, there's no archaeology here at all. It's all been quarried away.
So there's no archaeology here then?
I think Phil's fed up digging trenches with nothing in them. But I'm disappointed too. I was dreaming we might find Ethelred's palace here. But then suddenly I hear that Mick and Stuart know a lot more than they're letting on. Oh, you two have got a bone to pick with you.
Oh yeah, why is that?
Have you been holding something back?
Oh, almost certainly from you. We try and keep you in the dark as long as possible, you know that.
What is it?
This on the map.
Supposed site of Ethelred's palace here.
Look, come here. Look, supposed site of Ethelred's palace.
I thought you'd like that.
We're in day 2. We've been looking for the damn thing for
there is a reason
Yeah.
we've not told you too much about this. I mean, basically, we're digging over here, on this side of the village. This is right on the other side of the village.
This map was made in 1876. And Stuart reckons it's another example of the map makers recording what the locals thought was in the field, rather than knowing what was actually there.
There is some documentation that suggests that the abbots of Westminster are building themselves a new manor house or a new palace in the 14th century. And because this is a rectangular moat, that's the most likely site for it. But you're quite right, we're going to do some geophysics in that area and put a trench across it, if nothing else to dismiss it. I mean, if it's 14th century, we would need to know that, don't we?
Geophys are only too pleased to escape the problems of small back gardens, and they've already surveyed a small area of this open field. And the first trench will go in here. So far, all of our trenches have been put in without any real target from Geophys. And now that we've got something solid to go for, Phil's keen to get the first trench started.
It's very, very compacted
Right.
and very, very broken limestone. But I just wonder whether this could be the wall line that John has picked up. Is this where...
Could it be? Of course it is.
It looks a bit more obvious on your geophysics than this, though, John. It looks a bit more obvious on the geophysics than that.
Believe the geophysics.
You didn't tell me that it was specifically a wall. You said there was a large anomaly there.
No, there's a wall coming through diagonally.
Oh.
And then you've got a sort of tower, gate, double-storey building here.
Why am I bothering to dig it, John?
I don't know.
No one's ever excavated here before, but our experts reckon that the lumps and bumps showing in this field, which are especially clear in this 3D model, all point to this being the site of a medieval manor house that we know was built in Islip by Westminster Abbey. What we don't know, of course, is if the medieval house was built on the site of an earlier Saxon palace. This is something we can ask Helen and Sam to investigate by looking at the original medieval documents kept at Westminster Abbey.
John Fleet's chronicle dates from the middle of the 15th century, and this is one of the manuscripts of it. And you can see that it says here, William de Kirklington, the abbot. This father built the manor of Islip in the earldom of, in the county of Oxford, from the foundations, from new, very splendidly, sumptuose.
So that must be our building that's down as Ethelred's Palace, that we know is a medieval manor.
Right.
So we know it's. So what do we know archaeologically? We know it's very splendidly built, newly built.
From the foundations, and it dates from between 1315 and 1333.
Well, for once, the archaeology is agreeing with the documents. There's no Saxon palace in this field. But what we have here is a chance to investigate a forgotten medieval manor house that's very much part of the story of Westminster Abbey and medieval Islip.
As you come along here, the most important thing is we've actually got part of the wall that runs around the outskirts of the manor. You see, we've got one edge there, that's the inside edge, and then on the outside edge here, so we've got the wall running parallel with the moat, and then on the outside again we've got a lot of clay, which I think is part of the bank, which is stacked up against the wall.
But the thing we've discovered now is, this is where we've put the trench over these anomalies here. Now we've extended the survey across the field. Look at these responses.
Cool.
The main building is about 30 metres over there. We're only in outbuildings over here.
Mick wants to investigate the main building tomorrow, which means we should be able to tell the villagers quite a lot about at least one fancy building built by Westminster Abbey. But what about the other building that we've been struggling to find, the chapel of Edward the Confessor, which was up on the hill? We've put in trenches in the garden at Confessor's Gate, and the woodyard, and the pub car park without any success. And last I'd heard, our latest garden trench here had found only natural soil. But apparently all that's changed. Right, so this trench must be important if Jonathan's got his hands dirty.
I'll dig for me supper.
And you've done an extension.
Here, yes.
Nobody tells me anything. Could it be the chapel?
Do you know, I think it can. And the reason I say that is because it's roughly where Stuart had mapped it. We've got a wall coming down here. It's cut into this, see the shade of mucus there in the clay. That would be the outside of it. That's the inside. The wall thickness is about right. If that's the north wall, this is the west one, then we're looking for a door just the other side of the garden wall.
So it could be this corner here, look. Northwest corner like that. Yeah.
Raksha, who's queen of the dig?
Me!
Brilliant. This was one of the two buildings on this 1806 map that are the right east-west orientation. We haven't been able to get permission to dig this one, which is under the graveyard. But we don't need to dig it now, because it looks like this is the building we're after. We think we found one of the 4-foot wide walls of the chapel in this tiny garden. We'll see more of it tomorrow, but right now, I think we all need a drink. The last 2 hours have been quite remarkable.
Amazing, amazing finish to the day.
I think we're in for a fairly long evening this evening. Cheers.
Yay.
Beginning of day 3 in our search for Edward the Confessor's chapel. And in this garden yesterday, we put in loads of trenches and found virtually nothing except for a rather manky, cobbled farmyard surface. And then round about 4:45 in the evening, beyond that wall there, Raksha put in a trench and found what we think is the corner of the chapel. How did she do it? Well, she went below what we'd previously thought was undisturbed natural earth and got the wall below it. So today, this is what we think is the natural here, but we're going to get our archaeologists to go below that to see if we've got anything medieval too. The theory is we've discovered the northwest corner of the chapel in this garden. And it's possibly the only bit that survives, as we've dug other trenches close by and found nothing. We can't open any more trenches, which is why we thought it was worth digging deeper here, just to see if we get any related finds. But every one of us, I think, is just relieved to have found it. This picture shows the chapel long after it had been turned into a barn in the 1700s. But it was built in the 1220s to promote the cult of St. Edward. it meant that pilgrims could not only visit his tomb at Westminster Abbey, but also worship here at the place of his birth in Islip. Was it a popular cult? Were people flocking to worship at the shrine of Edward the Confessor?
Not as far as we can tell. There isn't a single pilgrim badge from Islip known, and there aren't very many known from Westminster. Nearly all our pilgrim badges seem to be from Canterbury, which is a really popular place and became very, very rich. Westminster just never had that popular appeal. It was always somewhere for kings, not somewhere for your normal person.
So Canterbury had its own shrines?
That was Thomas à Becket, who was really the people's saint, and St Edward was a bit more the king's saint, I'm afraid.
How long did the cult last?
Well, it doesn't seem to have functioned terribly successfully, despite the great ideals with which it begins. And there were investigations because allegedly they were not maintaining daily services in St Edward's Chapel here in Islip for the soul of St Edward, which was clearly part of their duty to give them that tax-free status.
So I've got this picture that everyone's flocking to Thomas à Becket at Canterbury. The king's pumping money into this cult of Edward the Confessor, but it's not really working. Would that be fair?
I think so, yes.
But Westminster Abbey can't have been doing too badly, because out in this field, we're digging up a large manor house built by the abbot around 1320. We decided to dig here because an old map had this field marked as the site of Ethelred's palace, where Edward the Confessor was born 1,000 years ago. But we've now proved that the only important building remains in this field belong to the medieval manor. Yesterday, GeoPhys revealed this plot showing the extent of it, and today we're opening up trenches here, over what we think is the manor house itself, a building that must have been one of the biggest and grandest houses in the area.
We know it must have been quite special because Isabella, Edward II's queen, stays here. And so it's certainly fit for a royal residence. And I think this would have been really sumptuous, whereas Ethelred's palace, or so-called palace, which was allegedly on this site, probably was just quite a simple hunting lodge. And we don't know that for sure, but we do know that he had a hunting lodge at Brill, a really quite a nice place there.
That's right.
And that's very close.
Construction job.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's more important than this then in Ethelred's time?
Yes, I think it probably is, except that this is where Edward is born.
But you see, that's interesting, because I think we've been rather assuming that it's a fairly big, sort of extensive complex, but it may not be from the implication of what you're saying.
Well, it isn't really. I mean, in Doomsday, if you look at Doomsday, it's quite small.
It still seems most likely that the Saxon settlement was on top of the hill. But it could be that Islip was an even smaller place than Victor's drawn here.
Have I got enough houses in there? Should I put any more in there?
I don't think you want a lot of houses. I mean,
No.
again, going by Doomsday book, it's really quite small. It's about 5 hides, I think.
You might have to rub some out, Victor.
Ah.
I mean, if it is a very small settlement outside, that might be one of the reasons we're not finding much pottery.
Yes.
And we're only digging in very limited areas as well, so the chances of finding it can get quite remote when you're digging in that way.
Yeah.
As team leader, it's Mick's job to gather up the information and try and make sense of it. So what's he thinking at the moment?
I don't think there's any doubt that Edward the Confessor's born here, but I think there's a series of assumptions after that are really questionable.
Like what?
Edward's born here, there must be a royal estate here.
Yeah, Buckingham Palace.
There must be a royal palace here.
Yeah.
And so you go, royal birth, da-dunk, 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 and in no time at all, you're looking for a royal palace.
Yeah.
What the archaeology's shown us is there really isn't much up on the top of this hill that we can find that's before Saxo-Norman times. There's not a great palace complex, there's not masses and masses of pottery and so on. And it's not until you get the ownership by Westminster Abbey and the cult develops that you start to get the interest in the place.
Helen's got a theory about how Edward came to be born here that perhaps hasn't been considered by other historians.
As I'm pregnant at the moment, my baby's supposed to be arriving quite soon. I'm becoming really aware that where you give birth, it may not be deliberate choice, it might be accidental happenstance. Do you think we're actually reading too much into the fact that Edward was born here at Islip?
That's a really interesting idea, because I think there is a big question mark about what sort of residence Ethelred has got here. We know he's got a really very fine hunting lodge at Brill, which is not very far away at all. And possibly here all he has is quite a simple wooden building where he would perhaps sometimes stay overnight from Brill or something like that. And maybe indeed Emma just gets her dates wrong.
So she could just have been passing through Islip and just got caught short.
Well, who knows?
If it doesn't happen to me.
Well, that's a good precedent.
It's an idea that the villagers will have to consider as they plan to celebrate the millennium anniversary of Edward's birth. But while they might be disappointed that we don't think there was a Saxon royal palace here in Islip, we reckon the posh medieval manor house that we're uncovering in this field should more than make up for it. Phil?
Yo!
Nice bit of wall in it.
Absolutely magnificent, isn't it? I mean, look at the size of it. And the beautiful thing of it is we can actually tell that where Ian is outside the building. You can see that it's just dirt and soil. And where I'm standing is inside the building. So we would expect to find the other wall somewhere there just inside the moat.
Can you definitely say that that's medieval?
Yes, I can, because all the pottery above it is medieval. There's nothing earlier or nothing later. It's sealed by medieval pottery, and more importantly, it's got a superb assemblage of roof tile. You want to have a word with Paul? He's eulogising about it.
Paul?
Hello.
Phil's waxing lyrical about what you found.
Yeah, I mean, just look at them. This is like a stunning collection of medieval glazed roof tiles. It's these incredible posh ridge tiles. I mean, this is only the sort of thing you would have got on a really big posh house in the medieval period.
They are a weird shape, aren't they?
Yeah, they call these coxcombs with the sort of the jagged top. You know, it's well, because they look like a coxcomb, I suppose.
Paul's not easily impressed, but it's unusual to get so many finds of such quality. Personally, I'm intrigued by this bit of medieval glass.
If you look at it, can you see how there's that flat bit there? Well, that's the interior and the base of the vessel. And if I turn it over, you can see this dimple here, and that's the outside base of it on which the vessel would have stood. And Paul and I have been looking through this book here, and we've come up with what we think it pretty much is, and that is a urinal.
A urinal?
Pretty exciting.
Do you mean
eh?
like a potty, a long potty?
Well, they're used for medicinal purposes. In the medieval period, the urine was a key to recognising the symptoms of lots of diseases by the medical practitioners at the time. So you'd have these glass vessels you'd put the urine in, hold it up to the light, and they'd make their pronouncements.
Make sure you wash your hands before lunch. It's been so much easier digging in this field as opposed to up on the hill, where we can only put in small trenches. But no one can accuse us of not trying hard enough. Today, here in the garden of Confessor's Gate, we've been digging deeper just to make sure we haven't missed any evidence relating to the medieval chapel we found next door. Wolf, yesterday I was giving your wife a really hard time because it seemed that your garden wasn't riddled with history in the way that you both hoped it would be. But this morning we had a reassessment. We realised that actually we hadn't gone down as far in these trenches as we needed to go. So Matt spent virtually the whole day re-excavating these trenches, and the news is I was right, there is no history in your garden.
There's nothing here at all.
Nothing here at all. As you can see, look at that.
It's a lovely hole.
Great big hole. Yes.
But the good news is that it looks as though next door we've got the chapel. So the value of their house is going to rocket now.
Thrilled for them.
Well, sold them the name.
As ever, back garden archaeology is a tricky business, and there's no predicting how it will turn out. Raksha, how's our chapel getting on?
It's not really a chapel anymore.
You're kidding.
No, it's a more humble building. It's a privy.
You're joking.
No.
So you've got a cesspit, in fact?
Yes.
Why? How do you know?
Found lots of degraded faeces, I'm afraid. There you go.
Of it down there.
And what's this thing here?
It's a nice kind of cauldron vessel, cooking pot that we found.
And you found it down the toilet?
Yes.
I can't imagine what it was doing down there.
What date is the cesspit?
The cesspit is about 17th century.
I can't believe it. Yesterday we were convinced we had a medieval chapel here. What happened? Raksha, as Queen of the Trenches, how could you mistake a medieval chapel for a 17th century toilet?
Well, it just shows it's an easy mistake to make. It also highlights that it's best to kind of dig down and actually find what archaeology is underneath, because you can't tell by just looking at the top of it.
What was it that was at the top that made you think, hey, we could have the chapel here?
It was when I just dug down a little bit and you could just see the stones peeking out. So, you know, they are foundation stones of a wall, but of a smaller building.
We only had this one trench open at that stage as well, didn't we? It was only when we opened it out and went further back.
That we found the other side.
Yeah.
Stuart thought the chapel was here too. What's his excuse?
We were reasonably confident this was going to be the site of the chapel. We know there was a barn here until relatively recently. And there's this quote written in 1843 which probably illustrates why it's so difficult to find some of these things. It said it continued to be used as a barn or outhouse until about 1780, when being found dangerous, it was taken down and the present barn constructed out of its materials. So it was actually physically taken down. We kind of hope we'd find some evidence of it, but it ain't there.
So we're in the right vicinity.
Oh, yeah, there's no
probably,
doubt we're in the
without
right patch for it, yeah.
But just can't see it in any of the sections we've got.
So it's not here. What a way to end a dig. I don't think I've ever felt so disappointed. What really hacks me off is that I'd assumed that at the end of the programme I would be standing here surrounded by one of those fantastic Time Team graphics of the chapel with those great walls shooting up in the air and that huge roof and those very interesting windows, and instead I guess you'll have to make do with a drawing of some old bloke sitting on a 17th century loo. And now, with a big turnout of villagers all eager to hear how we've got on, Mick has to explain that we haven't found any evidence of the Confessor's Chapel.
Well, it's one of the problems, you see. You dig lots of holes, and I've been saying this for 13 years now, you can't guarantee what you're going to find.
He also has to tell them that we don't believe there was a Saxon royal palace here either. But you do think that it's quite likely that he was born here,
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
But it's not all bad news, because what we can show them is the impressive remains of the moated medieval manor house that once occupied this field. Built around 1320 by Abbot Kirtlington of Westminster Abbey, this would have been a collection of separate stone buildings set around a great hall. And with its newly channelled water supply, fish ponds and extensive grounds, this was a manor house literally fit for royalty to visit. And yet, it had been largely forgotten until now. Do you think we've contributed something to the Millennium celebrations?
Yeah.
Well, that's a relief. I think we've certainly shown how important Islip is to English history and that it was the birthplace of Edward the Confessor. But I think from our point of view, what we've learnt yet again, if we needed to learn this, was that archaeological reality is always far more complicated than the stuff of legend.